So for this episode, we tried something new. This show is in its 9th year of production, and we realized that we as hosts very rarely have interacted on the show with each other. And while this is a project that is one we do for reasons other than boosting our own personalities, we talked about it and felt it was time for us to interview each other and give some personal context for why we do what we do. To that end, we are actively searching for another co-host. This would obviously be an unpaid position until we all get our Soros checks, but the responsibilities would be gently scaled up to. If you like what you hear here, you want to work with us, and have always wanted to do something like this, or have done something like this in the past and want to jump back on, holler at us via email. Okay, I hope you enjoy this, and on to the podcast special.
Testing.
I haven't looked at these questions since I made them.
I recall them being pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
And just up front, and just sort of like a way for us to open this up and get personal.
Get personal.
Getting personal.
Yeah.
This podcast extra mini-sode. Well, would you introduce yourself for the listening audience?
Yeah, of course. My name's William. I have been doing the radio show for 6 years, something like that. And I live here in Asheville, North Carolina. I don't really know what else to say other than that.
Any backstory? Any,
Yeah. Our second question is tell listeners a little bit about yourself, which could very easily be part of this first question.
Do you want to go back and forth, or do you, or should we just one of us talk and then the other talk?
I mean, I think that, we're talking to each other, but we're also talking to a, invisible, unnamed, faceless audience. So making it comprehensible in that way would I think work well. William is not the name I use in my normal life. Yeah, how about you?
My name's Versts, or this is the name that I go by in this project, and in a lot of circles, it's not necessarily my legal name. Haha.
It's an old family name.
Burst of Goodness from the clan O' Goodness in Northwest Ireland. But yeah, I've been living in Asheville for about a decade, and started working with Asheville FM right around the time I think that I moved here. So that's been almost a decade too, well before it was on the air, and came up with this show. It'll be 9 years on May 5th, I want to say. Yeah, that the show has been going, and was joined 6 years ago by this guy.
You said you thought of the show 9 years ago. What were you thinking of when you decided to do it?
So I was doing another show with some friends, Shantron and Beale, and that radio show, Doing Being, was mostly just music and us bantering, and that's just how a lot of podcasts and radio go, is just drive time, whatever. And we decided to end that project, and had been interested in starting a reading group to discuss, just to share stuff, just read stuff and have stuff to discuss. And we were like, why don't we put that on the radio? So we started by reading some sci-fi and watching some movies, and then planned to record hot takes off of that, or have a discussion afterwards. And I don't think it really happened, but I kept pushing that I wanted to read anarchist things and talk with other people about those anarchist things, and they at the time were interested in other things. So we sort of parted ways, and I started making this show as a way to talk to other anarchists about anarchist things, in some cases authors, and in some cases activists. And so the first couple of episodes, the first episode was I talked to some folks, some gender nonconforming folks who had faced harassment from vehicles in town.
There was some fairly targeted harassment of specifically like trans and queer people in Asheville at around the time.
Yeah.
Folks rolling up in pickup trucks and doing shit.
Yeah, and that's what, like, I talked to 2 or 3 folks from that in the first episode. They'd refused to talk to other media at that point because they didn't trust the media around here, so I sort of, like, was trying to position it as an anti-repression tool and a chance for friends and comrades to, like, anonymously, if they needed to, share the experiences they were going through. And this is also, we started the radio show, although it had been in the planning for a while before, like within a week of the Mayday mini riot that happened in downtown Asheville that led to the Asheville 11 case. So I was also kind of imagining it at that point as being an anti-repression tool for getting word out about that case, and trying to get more attention brought on it and more of a, like, platform for comrades who are facing conspiracy charges to be able to speak from it. I didn't get any of them to come on the show and talk about it at any point, but that was sort of like a part of an inspiration.
I like that it came out of basically like a hate attack, not to like use a liberal word or a word that's been co-opted into like liberal rhetoric, but like a hate attack for people to interface with media who aren't necessarily trusting of media or welcome by like more mainstream media platforms. And that's interesting to me, and what was interesting and still remains interesting to me, that was sort of like the origin of this radio show.
At the time that you started working on the show, what was it that made you interested in joining up and sacrificing all these hours?
Well, yeah, the answer to that question is like both simple and complex, maybe. So we, Bursts and William, like have a relationship outside of this radio show, and we're like developing a friendship, and you were basically like how I basically tell the story to people of how I got into radio, which isn't the whole story but is the soundbite, is you were like, I'm losing my mind, will you help me do this thing? And I was just like, I could never do that. I'd never considered doing something like this ever in my life, though I had like tangled with the art form of radio in some extremely small way, like as a kid, as a child, through like a really, really rinky-dink community radio station in southern New York State, which is near to where I grew up. And now, like 6 years later, I'm like finding myself the co-host of a weekly anarchist radio show. So I see radio, my involvement in radio, as being something that hopefully like augments my own like anarchist praxis and anarchist analysis. Sometimes it is not that, which is okay. But I also see this as something that like augments the friendship that you and I have and the relationship that you and I have, and is something that like has grown a lot in the time that we've been doing it. And to me, like, my friendship and comradeship with you is like what drives it for me, pretty much. There are other things as well, like things that I'm interested in. I have a very work-phobic, I'm a working class person. I've been working class, working poor all my life. I've been working in like service industry, and I've done like more gig work, like sex work, and just odd jobs since I was 14. So I'm somebody who like doesn't really want to be doing that stuff. And sometimes my mentality with the radio show slips into like I start to use language for it that's like, oh, this is work. And it is in a way, but it's not like gig work. It's not like going to my restaurant job where I like cook a ton of food every day for very little pay. It's something else, and it's something different, and there's no pay involved, but it's a bigger thing, you know, and in many ways it like takes up 90% of my headspace. But yeah, I mean, I sort of experience myself as being, as having fallen into it without really meaning to, which is an unsatisfying answer. I don't know if there's like more I can say about that, but that's how I might answer that question.
I haven't really asked anyone else to join this project. Like, we've talked about different people having corollary relationships and providing content or helping us like seek out questions or whatever, but when I asked you to get involved, I don't remember the I'm going crazy part, but but I'm sure it was there because I've gone over the edge since. But but I do remember specifically, and I forget who I was telling a friend during a drive the other day. They were just asking about the show and how it started. And yeah, I remember asking you specifically because doing organizing or whatever, like activism, whatever, work with you and sharing social space made it so that like I got to experience you being a very active listener and really paying attention and asking what I thought were poignant questions to prompt conversations. And there's like an empathy to the way that you communicate that I think is like makes for easy listening and like easy to converse with. And so that and your sharp brain, like, those are all things that made me think that you would be like a really good fit in this project or in whatever kind of project. And I'm glad that I'm glad we've been working together for this long on this project. And I think that if this project were to end or whatever, which, I mean, everything ends, I think it would be, I could understand it, but I could see it as kind of a waste if you didn't go on to do work in a similar vein or use that part of your brain to like work on stuff, because I think you got a talent for chatting with people.
Thanks, Bursts. Gosh. Yeah, similarly, I really appreciate the way you frame stuff, and I really appreciate working with you on this show. Like, I've learned a lot, and I hope to continue to like do the work and like do this stuff. But yeah, thanks for saying that. It was really appreciated. Do you feel like telling listeners a bit about yourself, or
yeah,
do you feel like you want to? Or?
Let's see. So I'm in my early 40s, and got involved in politics through like being around and in like Catholic scene that was influenced by like liberal and lefty politics, including some liberation theology stuff that I didn't really get directly taught, but it was around. So that was like a troubling thing in part because like it's the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church does some really terrible things, but also there's a lot of people in the Catholic Church, and there's a mindset in the Catholic Church, a like communist mindset that is very much about social justice, and so there's lots of progressive and left activists in that theology that I think take things in a pretty good direction. I've definitely got my critiques, and I'm not a Catholic, but there was lots of activism around that time around the death penalty. There was military incursions into Europe by the U.S. and into parts of Africa, and the recent history of U.S. military incursions in Latin America that were still ongoing, but they were less direct. It was more funding right-wing death squads and funding military dictatorships and stuff like that. But so that was in like the popular memory, and there was a lot of like leftover from the 70s resistance to imperialism. That was in the Northern California community that I grew up in. So that's basically like how I got into politics. I remember one time going with a Catholic school group in high school down to Tijuana and just visiting institutions that the Catholic Church was involved with that were charitable institutions, like a worker's house and an orphanage, and going to the border to like serve food to people and do this biblical like washing people's hands and feet for them, and all sorts of like service oriented engagement. So we had our high school had like a Amnesty International chapter there to focus on human rights issues. And between getting involved in like with that mindset and framing, we were involved in anti-death penalty work and that brought me into contact with folks that were organizing around current cases of people who were facing execution. And one of those, that was during like the heyday of the mid-90s, like Mumia Abu-Jamal push. So that got me into contact with folks that were anti-capitalists that were advocating for that specific prisoner. And he was still on death row at the time. So that got me into contact with anti-capitalists, and I had been seeing also anti-war demonstrations around bombings in Belgrade and other parts of the former Yugoslavia. And, you know, bombs hit marketplaces and hospitals and schools as well as hitting military targets. And that's like kind of the crazy thing about the world that we're in right now, is that's a kind of normalized thing in the way that America deals with insurgencies in different parts of the world. But I came across anarchists in those scenarios and at least thought they've got panache and style, and didn't really get into the ideas until the late 90s. I ended up in college getting involved with Project Censored, which is, it was at the time like a pretty well-respected, no shade meant, but it was at the time a pretty well-respected like media outlet on the left side that would critique, like talk about the confluence between ownership of the means of media and the centralization of that and the influence that it had on the type of debate that happened in print media in the United States. It's kind of lost its footing. I'm not sure where it's at right now, but it was losing its footing at one point because truthers were involved in like pushing the agenda of discussing the 9/11 attacks in a way that was unorthodox, to say the least. And that lost it some cred, and also print media being such a still dying landscape. I don't know if they've changed their rules of engagement with like what they review as being U.S. media, or if they've shifted to electronic means as well, or what. But that was like my first foray actually into radio. We had a radio show that was briefly produced. We also had a TV show that was briefly produced. Some folks from KPFA, the Pacific Outlet in Berkeley, trained some of us on the equipment. And I did a little bit of coverage about the DNC protests in 2000 in Los Angeles. Yeah, and did a little radio in college. And then didn't do any until I came here. I really want to do some pirate. There was some pirate radio in Northern California that I had friends that were involved with, but I never actually got around to doing that.
There was also some pirate radio here for a really long time. And it's funny, like, when you were answering the question, or when you were talking about the show Doing Being, it sounds very much like a lot of the podcast formats that are really popular now.
But way less funny.
Less funny?
Yeah.
I don't believe that.
I could probably find some files somewhere.
Oh, cool. Cool. I would enjoy that. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, though. Radio is a format that's, like, kind of gone in and out of style. And now that, like, people are podcasting now, I mean, I don't really care if you call it a podcast or a radio show. It's, like, kind of still the same thing. Though, like, one is notably not regulated by the FCC, which is its own special headache to consider.
I tend to push back personally about the, like, do we call this project a radio show or a podcast? And that's just probably because I'm old. But, like, I think that there's a lot of like dudes behind a mic talking into a podcast, and that's fine. And there's some great stuff that gets made, and that's not all the voices that we have on the show by any means. But because of the magic that both of us have, like, talked about, but, like, the way that I look at it is, yeah, it's regulated by the government. There's only so many. It's got this, like, very furtive element to it. It only is in one place through the air for one period of time. It's like listening to a record versus, like, a digital file. You know, or maybe better a cassette tape, because you can't as easily tell where tracks begin and end. Excuse me. But, like, I think that it's the fact that it only lasts so long, like the broadcasts, the emissions, and they only go in certain places, but that they're free and you can get a hold of it with really low tech at a really low cost. It kind of feels like doing anarchist propaganda in any case. Like, there's tons of books that we're surrounded by right now, for instance, in this room, in our recording studio, one of them. But like, I think there's something kind of beautiful for the fact that it doesn't last that long. It's like seasonal or whatever. It passes. Yeah. But also the fact that it passes a muster, like that people that run radio stations are like, hey, this is like, even if we're going to put it on at 2:00 in the morning, it's still like, this is something that we will stand behind qualitatively to put on our airwaves, and something that might sink the rest of the ship if like somebody had an issue with it on a radio station. It could get, like, a lawsuit could damage a whole radio station with all those hours of programming that they do every week. It's a point of pride for me, because anyone can make a podcast. The equipment's there, but not anyone can necessarily get onto a radio station. That's my long answer for that.
It wasn't even necessarily a question, but more like an observation. Yeah, I think that people really like stories, and I think that stories are maybe like one of the most fundamentally human things, for me at least. And growing up, I would only pretty much, like, I grew up in a religious cult, and we were not really allowed to, like, watch television, though some of us did, but we were allowed to listen to the radio for whatever reason, and I would listen to the radio a lot. And in the car driving around, I have my dial set to not anything like radical or like hard, but to like a top 40 station. And there's an ad on there that's like, radio is the medium that reaches the most people, millennials included, and stuff. And
even the kids,
even the children's. And I was just like, you're trying to sell me something. I was writing a PSA for Asheville FM, which is where this show like originally broadcast, and they just got done with their Spring Fun drive, and I wrote an ad that was like kind of based on an ad I hear a lot on Top 40. And I was just like, I kind of actually believe that, like, radio, it's accessible. You can find a radio transceiver, or like a radio receiver, in many different locations, including like on the streets or like in the prison cells or wherever. So yeah, that for me is why it makes sense. And there's something I think that like is very special about hearing voices from around the world and being able to empathize with things that are happening really far away, that I think can be very useful, and can be like useful to like an anarchist project or whatever.
I kind of worry about the prison thing, because as I understand it, like, so more and more prisoners have been able to buy off of like commissaries that are controlled by certain corporations, like JPay or whatever is one example. And so because they're offering this like neoliberal model of individualized consumers and also monetizing like their relationships with the outside of people who can buy stuff for them. I just talked to one of the people that produces Fire Ant Journal, which is an anarchist prisoner journal that's for free and distributed by Bloomington Anarchist Black Cross. And that person was talking about bringing care packages and food to long-term political prisoners back in the 90s, like Panthers and Black Liberation Army prisoners and MOVE prisoners and stuff like that. And that's like, it's not how stuff works anymore. You put money onto an account so they can buy from a specific company that is okayed to bring stuff in. Long story short, they're like monetizing every element. Video chats are replacing in-person visits in a lot of places because it's viewed as being less expensive. You don't have to bring staff to like bring someone down to a place to share air with someone else. So there's less security fears with that. Well, like the local jail here doesn't do in-person visits as far as I know. And that also affects the media landscape. Now, like JPay, again, for instance, has J-pods, where they've got these little devices. You buy stuff off of an account like the iTunes store sort of thing that's approved content, and then you can put it onto these pods or pads of various sizes and interface with the internet through the portals that they provide and with the media that you purchase or subscriptions you purchase through them. And so like radios are actually being phased out because they can't control the content in the way that they can control what gets downloaded from a certain store, over the Wi-Fi or whatever. Like it's so dystopian.
The evils of capitalism really, truly know no bounds. They would monetize the air if they could. And maybe at some point on the trajectory of this planet they will, because it'll be a hot commodity or whatever.
Isn't that a thing in like the Mel Brooks Star Wars take movie?
I've never seen that.
I can't remember. The Spaceballs, maybe, is I think one of the planets.
Oh no, I've totally seen
air
it.
supply is being privatized.
Yeah, and they get little like hits.
Yeah, they get little like cans of air if they can afford it. Yeah. Wow, Mel Brooks and his like insightful.
Shout out Mel.
Yeah, friend of the show. Blah blah. Next question.
Yeah.
What has surprised you about the show? What have you learned along the way?
What have I learned along the way? Like I said, I kind of got into this by accident. Or not by accident, but it wasn't a premeditated choice. So I came into it with like very few to no expectations. I think the only expectations I had were that it would be hard, and that expectation has been met. What have I learned along the way? I've learned how to do audio editing. I've learned that cold calling someone never gets better. It's always terrifying. Which, like, we just do so many cold calls, like, of phone calls of people, with people that you can't see their face. You know a little bit about them via, like, your own research, but you're basically, like, having a phone call with a stranger every week, which, like, never gets more comfortable. But it's, like, good because that's how we do our interviews. We can't fly out places to, like, do our stuff. What has surprised me about doing this show? I don't know. I went back and listened to a really old interview that I did, like one of the first ones, and I edit myself, like, the way that this show is structured, at least how I experience it, like, from, like, behind the scenes, is that we both work together on producing some of the content, but largely the content that each host produces is kind of their own thing.
So, like, if you're the person that does the interview that's featured, if it's just your voice as the interviewer for that episode, you're probably the person who did all the edits, right?
You're the person that did all the edits, but not only that, you researched the topic, you made interview questions, you're largely the one that set up the interview, and you're the one that, like, intellectually generated the idea to begin with. So in a way, like, this could be seen as, like, two separate sub-shows of the same show. And they are compatible with each other, but they're, like, done by two very different people operating with, like, sometimes different ideas of, like, what makes a good interview question or who to reach out to or what we're interested in. So that surprised me. I didn't expect that to be the case. I don't really know what I expected. I think in the beginning I was very much like, I don't know what to do. Like, you just toss me topics and I'll just see what I can do. But, like, you have your own life. You also have a job, and you also, like, have stuff to do that isn't to do with the radio show, and you can't be doing it all the time. So, I mean, part of why I guess, like, I was brought on or asked to participate or something, was to take some of that pressure off.
And also to contribute, like, that brain of yours, you know.
Also to contribute, but also to, like, do the weekly thing, you know, do the damn thing. from beginning to end, and to like be a independent actor in it, and that to me has been kind of cool to witness or to like participate in. So that's probably how I might answer that question. Do you have an answer to that question? What have you learned along the way?
So I think like maybe before the show actually aired, I had recorded these presentations from, there was a series, so like in the 2000s and the aughts, there had been these like series of public like anarchist conferences around the Southeast. I wasn't around for them, so I'm going to remember them by, I'm not remembering the name of it. Someone else will, I'm sure. But it was like, it wasn't, NC Homo is what was like made as like a joke about it afterwards, right?
Encore.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and then it was NC Homo National Conference for Hanging Out and Making Out. And then for 3 years, folks did this thing called NC Rising. And there was one in Raleigh in 2009, or Chapel Hill, and one at Warren Wilson in 2010 in Asheville, and then one in Greensboro in 2011. And those were like what happened before the ACAB book fairs started in Chapel Hill and Carborough. But so, yeah, I recorded the contents of some of the discussions there, the panels, and edited those. And that was like my first foray into like editing audio and Audacity and figuring out how stuff moves around. So anyway, that kind of a out of nowhere answer, but I was just thinking about it. But what have I learned? I've definitely learned some skills about recording. I've learned to, and we were talking about this the other day, like I've learned that sometimes something that a chat that I'm not necessarily excited to have because I don't think the person is going to answer in a way, the questions that I provide in a way that's interesting, can actually be quite surprising. And that's been a sort of, an inspiring realization for me. Like I'll go into something and be like, all right, well, this person has said that they would do an interview, but now that I'm looking at it, I'm not super stoked on this, not because they're problematic, but just they don't seem exciting. And then the chat actually goes wonderfully. And maybe it's just the fact that the questions that got asked and the dynamic that other interviewers or whatever other format that they interfaced with that I consumed didn't have the magic or whatever of the relationship that I had with them. Mm-hmm. And so those elements didn't get drawn out that were just below the surface anyway. And that's a part of what the person does. And I'm not going to point to any interviews in particular that's an example of, but yeah, I don't know. There's also like between setting up interviews with people in other countries and having these conversations with people, even if there's like a lot of hurdles to understanding, and these are all in English. So it's like when it's with non-English speakers, it's them doing the dirty work of translating their thoughts and ideas into English for this project. 'Cause I'm basically monolingual with some Spanish knowledge, but far from fluent. So like just like people going through the work of communicating their things and just how sharp people can be and how many anarchists there are in the world and anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist and feminists. And like, that's been really inspiring and kind of surprising. And also the relationships that get built out of stuff like this. Like it's still, our project is not a giant on the media landscape by any means, but it gets by. And the fact that for the last, like, barring this year, the prior 3 years, we attended, out of our own pockets, we attended gatherings in Europe with podcasters and radio people, like people who ran pirate stations, or people that did a podcast, or people that worked at radio stations and did an anarchist radio show, from so many different language groups and from so many different countries and regions in Latin America and Europe and North America, that it was just inspiring to like share space and build relationships with those individuals and continue to like, and I'm talking about the A Radio network right now, but like sharing that platform with people, even if it's imperfect and stuff mostly gets communicated in English. It's really inspiring to me. Yeah, I mean, those are the two things, I guess, that popped to my mind with that question of what surprised me.
Something that came to mind while you were talking is like that the process of interviewing somebody is really cool, and something that I'm like enjoying more and more as I go on. And sometimes I'm like really pleasantly surprised at like people's willingness to just talk to me, you know? And sometimes I get the impression that people are just waiting to be asked to talk about either themselves or like something that they're passionate about. So like the amount of times people will be like, "Oh yeah, I'll get on the phone and maybe we'll talk for 15 minutes," and I really don't have a whole lot to say, and then we'll end up talking for like an hour and a half or something like that. People are super smart, and once you provide some kind of like space to talk and questions for people to go off of, and sometimes it doesn't, like, everybody's really smart, but like sometimes it doesn't so much work that way because people have anxieties and stuff, and I super respect that. But sometimes people just, most of the time, more often than not, people just entirely overcome that and just talk really intelligently at length about super interesting stuff. And I really am delighted by that every single time. So, what are some directions that you'd like to see the show go in? Have you given that any thought? It's hard to think about this sometimes because we are on such a tight deadline all the time.
It kind of feels like the weekly deadline of having 58 minutes to 60 minutes edited, cleaned up, concise, and topical, like all that stuff, all the standards that we hold ourselves to, but that we hold ourselves to because we care about our audience, we care about doing a good thing, but also because we want to continue to get listened to and also broadcast. Yeah, that can kind of like choke some of the creativity. I think. I mean, I would like to see us start thinking more, and we have been thinking more about this, but more concerned about the quality of the recordings. As far as content, I don't know, because there's no specific directions that I would like to see us go that we don't go in. I mean, it would be great to... One part of me is like, it would be great to have more international discussions. Like, I really liked getting to talk recently with some Australians about anti-racist organizing there and about settler colonialism and like the frameworks that they talk about it in that instance. But also there's just so much going on domestically, and that I get to remind myself that like actually a lot of the comrades that are in Channel Zero Network, like IGDcast or the stuff that Submedia produces, although that's not time sensitive as much, or Kiteline or Rust Belt Abolition, like Subversion 1312, you've got like these projects that are like covering topics a lot better than we could from where we're at, and our collaboration is what brings that to the fore. We don't have to do everything to get it, to make sure that a thing gets covered or whatever.
Oh yeah.
That was a non-answer.
Well, we're also like, we're not like a one-stop shop. And we're not the only game in town, which is great. We shouldn't be. I don't see us as like the forefront of anarchist news gathering. We're not like a news show, you know. If you're looking to us to like get your news, you're going to be several days to several weeks to maybe even several months out of date.
To get back to the question more directly, I would like to see us focus on the quality of our recordings, the quality of the recording on the other side. I think we do a great job of doing the edits and making things listenable. I'd like to see us somehow incorporate something more towards like audio montage, but it's kind of hard to think outside of the framework that we've been like running with and slightly modifying over the course of years and years. What about you?
There are a few things that come to mind. One of them, we've like had a lot of some listener content. There's like one listener who's contributed, I think, 2 or 3 pieces, And we've had like a few guest interviewers, but having the show, like I'm really interested in sort of like if people want to use this as like an outlet or a platform for like if they're doing cool shit or if they have a cool interview that they want to see on the airwaves or whatever, and it fits with like what we can accommodate. I would love to see more of that stuff. And since like audio recording is now a way more accessible technology than even it was, 3 or 4 years ago, that's a bit more possible than it used to be. And I think the potentialities there are very exciting.
Some more listeners sending in content.
Yeah, I mean, if people want to, like, nobody has to, like, we're still gonna, like, do our stuff, but that kind of thing, I would, I have no idea how this could be achieved, but it might be cool for us to do some on-the-ground stuff, like, on-the-ground, like, we have a portable mic, it's sitting right here, gotten for this purpose pretty much, which has been used for this purpose, but also like for other things as well. But like, going to an event and recording, that's been done, but like going to a protest and recording, that kind of hasn't been done yet by us. Whether or not we'd want to do that, whether or not we want to be that guy at the protest is kind of up for debate, because like there's the thing of like, oh, if there's something to do, I want to go do it. I don't want to hide behind a screen, and I don't so much want to like hide behind a microphone. I kind of just want to go do something. And not that like hiding behind a screen isn't doing something, because it quantitatively is, but that's a discussion that we have had in the past, but it might be a discussion that we could have off mic a little bit more. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. It would be cool to like have some space to do some more audio montage kind of projects. Maybe get a little bit more creative with like the style of show that we put out, and that simply I think would mean growing our collective. Which maybe that's a provocation if anyone listening like wants to do that, but also it's just an observation as well. I think there's a lot of like potentiality there, and there's also a lot of potentiality to be stale, which is like our problem or whatever, like our issue, if that's the case.
I'd like to hope we're not too stale. Yeah, I think growing the collective would be really awesome. It's unpaid labor, so it would have to be a crime of passion.
Yeah.
Really, really upselling right now.
I mean, yeah, but it's you hear, yeah, you hear what we do. You're probably already familiar. In doing this show, are there things that you've been disappointed by?
Yeah, to be frank, like, I've been disappointed at times by lack of engagement, and also by what I can tell. Like, it's just kind of hard. And this is the thing that I've heard from people that are engaged in other anarchist podcasts that do get like wider distribution than we do. And just people that do podcasts or radio, of just like the feeling of screaming into the void, of just not getting feedback, not being able to tell how many people are actually listening, not actually seeing what kind of like wider impact one has on like the political landscape. Because like this is fun. Like it's a thing that I do that I appreciate. But if I could come to a point where I realized that it was not effective and and I couldn't figure out how to make it effective, I would stop doing it, probably.
What do you think? Because like I think the question of efficacy is really interesting. What does efficacy, like feeling effective, mean to you?
Feeling effective means, like, to some degree, being able to measure that there are a lot of people that are engaging with the content and moving forward with it in whatever way, not necessarily just just doing the thing that our guest suggests gets done, but like starting a discussion based on like, oh, we heard this thing get said on this radio show, like let's go demonstrate at the Turkish consulate, or let's talk about conflict, let's talk about humor, let's talk about, you know, how that affects our praxis. Like that's a thing that I don't really get, except actually, like, here's an interesting example. Like, this is not the people that I thought that would take and run with this, but someone from ROAR, not the conference, but the Rural Organizing.
Against Racism?
No, they changed the name. Rural Organizing and Resiliency, which is based in like some of the more rural counties around here, I think specifically in Madison County. But I had a couple of folks from that come on the show and talk about the organizing that they do. And they got word that some DSA, I think, in Ohio had come across, or some Democratic Party group in Ohio had come across the interview and were having their friends listen to it and people in their organization listen to it in order to like talk about, to problematize how they engaged with organizing in rural communities that they lived in or were surrounded by. Like that's a material like outcome and like a show of efficacy for me, that somebody has like taken this conversation that was had and said the contents of this are useful enough that I would like to like apply parts of this where I am and see how this shakes things up. That's just like one example of what I think efficacy is. But measurability of like listenership, I think people don't waste time on things that aren't important to them. So if we can measure that somebody is wasting their time on the stuff that we think is important for them, then, i.e. listening to our show, then that is like a show of efficacy. But otherwise, like years ago I talked to, and I'm forgetting his name right now, but an anarchist historian who was looking at cultural production in anarchist communities from the late 1800s through the mid 1900s, and hearing about different newspapers or magazines or occasionally radio shows or musical projects or whatever throughout that time period in ways that people reproduced or produced culture, and the impacts that culture had on the other people around them. Like that's the kind of efficacy that I guess it takes a historian to look back at and say like, look, like all these people watched this movie and started using it as a cultural touchstone. And that's the kind of impact I guess you don't find out until way later that you've had.
It's also like we live in a time of just like constant fucking noise. You know, there's so many radio shows, so much like media and TV and ads and just shit everywhere that, yeah, looking at that in the moment is not only like historically impossible, but also like it might be totally different at this time because like the landscape of technology and the landscape of media is changing a lot, has changed a lot even like since I was a kid. So yeah, it's hard to know.
Are there any disappointments that you want to gripe about?
Disappointments, like I said, I mean, I might frame this like I framed an earlier question, and reiterate very briefly that I got into this with no expectations other than that it would be hard. But, I mean, I've been personally disappointed in myself. And that is real, but also maybe not an answer to that question. Like, I'm somebody who struggles with a shit ton of like mental health issues and all that good stuff. So, I mean, there are things I'd like to see. I mean, I'd love to see like, yes, we listened to this Final Straw episode, or, you know, whatever, this other like anarchist episode, and we went and we like, you know, appropriated the police station, and like now we have a town without cops and stuff. Or
yeah,
whatever.
that happened. We haven't talked about that yet. We'll talk about that later.
We'll talk about that later. Yeah, stay tuned.
DCSC.
But yeah, I mean, like that's a hyperbolic example, but I don't really think that media works that way right now, just because of how much noise there is. I think if we were the only game in town, or if we were like the only show out there, or we were like the only like audio storytellers, or like audio purveyors of radicalness, then it might have some more of an effect in that way. But I mean, I've heard a lot of people say that they like listen to this show because they are the only anarchist they know. Like, there was this younger person from a super rural town in North Carolina who, like, either wrote to the show or approached us somehow at, like, a tabling event and was just like, I listen to y'all because I'm the only one I know. And it makes me feel less alone. And to me, that's very moving. And now, of course, they have 19 other shows to choose from to feel less alone, and that's even better and even more moving. But yeah, I mean, so I would say, like, are there things you've been disappointed by? No, there haven't been, other than personal disappointments in myself.
Or people not getting back to you.
Yeah, that's a bummer. Okay. That's a bummer. I'm just like, oh yeah, I was really interested in this interview, and like somebody ghosted, or I'm also not very aggressive, so I need to work on that. Our next question is something that I think we've talked about, which is how has the media landscape changed in the time this show's been on air? We can skip that. I feel fine about that, unless you want to talk about it.
I guess just to reiterate that I'm personally really stoked on. I listen to a lot of podcasts just to sort of like gauge what other folks are talking about, and because I enjoy the styles of storytelling and the jokes that they tell, and it's not all anarchist content. Most of it is like radical anti-capitalist stuff, and the fact that I can just rabbit hole down that is like kind of awesome. But yeah, I'm stoked for more people doing that and going through like the hurdles of figuring out how to do a thing that's kind of difficult, and find a voice and also find the skill set to be able to do the stuff. And I would love, it's not exactly what the question is, but I would love to see more anti-authoritarian content coming out of like demographics that don't look like me. And just because this is how not because I think that would change, like be a huge game changer for society, but because I enjoy hearing people's stories and hearing people's perspectives, and this is the medium that I tend towards, and I just want to hear more of those perspectives that take into account things that I wouldn't necessarily think of, and help make me a better person by suddenly having that perspective in my head. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. How do you see this show fitting into the current political landscape, William?
Well, bursts. I see it as, in some small way, mirroring it. And yeah, I think like radio is this like beautiful thing, and storytelling and all that stuff, but it's also a tool to. I think what it does is, well, I don't know, like current political landscape. We could think about that in two different ways, right? We could think about that in terms of anarchists and like anarchism and the project of anarchy, or projects of anarchy. And we could also think of it in terms of like the wider political landscape. And in the wider political landscape, I think it is a speck in an ocean, right? Like even though there have been a few times when we've been like, we covered this, and then Democracy Now! Did something about it a couple episodes later, enough times to where we're like, Yeah.
There was one Against the Grain where they interviewed Dean Spade, like a month after I interviewed Dean Spade, and they asked some of the very specific questions that I asked also, and I'm like, this project that I've been listening to for decades now
is biting off.
That's which is great. Fine. Yeah. I thought it was a good question.
I don't know, there's maybe currents that I'm like not locating in like the wider political landscape, But also, like, in anarchist landscapes, I only really know what people tell me, and, like, people don't really tell me all that much. But, like, I know that I'm really informed by, like, the interviewees that I choose to pursue. I'm really informed by both, like, what I read and what I locate and what I observe, but also by my own experience. Like, I am a trans person. I am the kid of an immigrant. I'm mixed. So, like, I'm very informed by those experiences and by those lived experiences, which is not really to answer the question, but is to be like, yeah, I think it's like a tool and a mirror, and hopefully something that is like augmenting struggle and not detracting from it or being weird about it, you know. I think it's always good to like hear other perspectives of people who are like for liberation in a not shitty way. And people are doing that all the time, all over the place. But yeah, I don't really know much more than that. That was like kind of an odd question. I don't really know why I included that. But yeah, I mean, the last one is, or the second to last one is.
Well, I'd actually say a thing about that odd question.
Yeah, of course.
We can skip the last question. That was.
I don't know that we are. I think we're responsible to answer all the questions.
Oh, okay, fine.
On the pad.
For the odd question, this is not so much about our project in particular, but I've been really inspired by the work that other comrades do, other audio comrades, and this is like, it's a weird comparison to make, but this is one that I make pretty frequently when talking about Channel Zero Network. It's got some like amazing people that are involved in it who are all stretched thin and doing their own work and living their lives and doing their projects. But I think that like one of the like stories that we tell ourselves about the success of Fox News as this insertion of culture war from the specific conservative directions into the U.S. landscape has been providing an easily digestible, i.e. like short on actual content, just kind of fear-mongering and playing with people's emotions, which is whatever. And this is conservative talk radio too, and this is me like reaching back 15, 20 years or whatever. But the expansion of these free news sources that are glossy into areas have shifted debate and discussion, and the ease of engaging with Fox or with the like Rush Limbaugh or whatever like talk radio stuff that liberals tried to reproduce with Air America back in the 90s. Like, I think that those are interesting things, and I think that Channel Zero could in some ways, if the infrastructure was actually more stable and we were able to put more energy into that infrastructure, could do something like that, pushing back in a different direction. And I've already talked to people who are like, yeah, I totally like had an office job and I just streamed Channel Zero, so it would like randomize. You'd get a Rebel Beat episode, and then a Burning Cop Car, and then R.I.P., and then a Final Straw, and then an IGD cast, or whatever. Like, you would get this like kind of randomized playlist of up-to-date, for the most part, up-to-date radical talk content in English. And I think that the more that we can think through how to make that stuff happen, and also how to make it attractive and get it into people's hands, the more we can, those little specks in the ocean become an island of plastic in the middle of the ocean. Oh wait, become a beautiful beach. That no, but the more that we can like,
I take your meaning.
Yeah, it's a little impact that collaboratively we can have a bigger one with. Anyway, that's.
Yeah, and like that's what I like about it. I'm really comforted by the notion of politics as being, because like I feel like we are all sort of acculturated by capitalism, and we have many forms of like work ethics and approaches to projects and approaches to task doings that are rooted in, you know, Christian ethics and settler colonial ethics. I'm really comforted by the fact that like the project that we're doing is one that is like big and unwieldy and decentralized, and we're all sort of just doing a part of it. Whether or not that's actually how it's working is sort of beside the point, at least for the purposes of self-soothing myself. It's just like a nice way of looking at it, being like, oh yeah, I don't have to do everything. I don't have to like burn the candle at both ends. I don't have to totally martyr myself or whatever, which is like, right, what like our jobs tell us all the time. You know, like I fucking had a job one time where it was literally like, when it was a restaurant, I was a cook in a restaurant. We had to sign something that literally said we had to think of our job as our second home, and our coworkers as our second family. And that to me is warped ass thinking. And that's like what we're fed all the time, right? Like that's what we have to work with. And that's the landscape that we are in, you know, but thinking about it as a collaboration, thinking about it as something that you can take space from and that other people will pick it up is really nice, for me at least. And yeah, Channel Zero has a lot of potential too, what with the streaming app and accessibility, you know. We've sort of spoken about this in pieces along the way, but like, are there things you'd like to do with the show that you haven't had the chance to do yet? And if so, what are they?
One thing that comes to mind is I would like to, and this from the research or whatever that I've done, this probably would take more travel to get some of this stuff done. But I want to hear from, like, there's a lot been said about anarchism as an approach, a political approach or philosophy, and anarchism writ large as opposed to just like specific ideologies, but it having a very European like bent to it. And I think that is true, that a lot of people can read. It's not the same as Marxism. Like, it's not the same as communism, where there's a like set list of readings that you're supposed to do to understand the philosophy. And while Marxism's approach towards breaking down economic systems, I think, is like really intelligent, I think that it's not a flexible model, or it doesn't provide a flexible approach towards differences in how people experience the world, let alone the nightmares that imposing Marxism through the state on a country have led to for the populations living in them. Like, I don't think that, I'm not advocating Marxism, but I will say that, like, I would like to hear more voices from parts of the world where people are anarchists to hear about their anarchism. Like, the time that I got to speak with folks from Maharlika, which is also known as the Philippines, about anarchism there was really eye-opening. The time that I got to spoke with folks in Indonesia about the anarchist organizing that they do and like the resistance that they have. Like, this is May 2nd when we're recording this. The stuff that again popped off in Indonesia, but also for the second year, like really visible, huge anarcho-syndicalist organizing in Bangladesh. Like, getting a chance to talk to some of those folks about the work that they're doing would be fascinating. I just got sent an email full of all these pictures from Bakirköy neighborhood in Istanbul, from DAF, of anarchist organizing that they're doing there. And getting to, like, a few years ago, I got to actually go to Turkey and sit down and talk to 3 folks who had some good English about the organizing that they were doing and how it interfaced with their majority Muslim society and struggle in Rojava and like ethnicity and class and gender, just all these things. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I really enjoy nerding out on, is just how do people think about these things in their own languages. How does that translate? What can that say about what it is to be a human animal in the world approaching liberation, and what sort of like innovations that other libertarian anti-capitalists have in different places? Like, how can their lessons work to like educate us? So like, long story short, I would love to be able to hear some more voices from Latin America and from Asia and from Africa about how, like, what informs folks' anarchisms. That's a thing that I would like the show to do. What about you?
Well, if you're listening and you made it through all that, you're still listening and you speak Bengali and you want to help me translate a potential interview with the Bangladeshi Anarchist Federation, hit me up at the Final Star Radio at riseup.net. I mean, there are an immense amount of things that I'd like to do with the show. That I'd like to go places and interview people, and not just interview people over the phone. Though, like, it's cool that we can do that, right? But I think that the times that I've been able to interview people in person, and just like being friends and comrades with you and getting to kind of co-interview with you right now, it feels different to talk to somebody in person. That's a personal wish on my part. So, I mean, it would be cool to be able to do that. But as far as like wishes for the direction of the show, or wishes for like a longer term project or plan, I don't really have many other than what we've been talking about.
What about getting paid?
Getting paid would feel weird. Honestly, it would feel weird to me to get paid to do this. But I could probably overcome that really fast.
So if you're listening, Papa Soros, and we know that you do listen every week.
I think you're mispronouncing his name. It's $OR $OS.
Yeah.
That's not just his.
That's how his name is.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I bring that up because I think that and here's $20 for this conversation.
Nice.
Yeah, I kind of think about the limitations of my ability to participate in this. I mean, at the moment, I have a lot of time on my hands, and so like it's okay for me to engage this passion. I have the ability to, and I've worked full time for long periods while doing this also, and with you. But it's been interesting asking for money to do this thing. So it's a kind of, what's the term that people use? Imposter syndrome, I guess. We're not really doing a thing, but I think that this project is a thing worth doing, and people are working anyway. It's not like there's money flowing through a lot of hands in the anarchist scene or anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist scene or autonomous scene or whatever. So if our listener base is, as poor as we are, then it's not surprising that we're not making much more money than it takes to like run the syndication service through Libsyn and pay for our PO box and a few other things. I think it would be nice if at some point we were able to get a stipend or some sort of funding in order to not make this a full-time thing, but so that we could afford to have a paid for trip to some conference to record the contents of the conference and bring those recordings back to people who couldn't actually attend the conference. And I think getting over that like imposter syndrome or that disgust of like not wanting to ask for money, I don't know, has allowed us to make some improvements. But also like the fact that we don't put anything behind a paywall. Like there's a lot of podcasts out there that create chat servers and like or have secret groups on Facebook where you can get special access to the hosts because you're giving in a certain amount of money every month, or you get like special access to the content. And like I think that it's fine if you're providing entertainment services, I guess, but since we're trying to amplify people's voices, it feels like it would be wrong with the nature of the guests that we get to, like, I've got this, like, really great interview with a prisoner who's stuck behind a wall. You know what else is behind a wall? This content. And you, like, have to pay a certain amount of money to be able to get access to hearing this prisoner's voice. Like, that would be fucked.
Unless we were raising money for that person. Yeah. Then and only then could I see it being in any way acceptable. But, like, to have that be a thing that we do, I would not be comfortable with that.
Yeah, maybe we could work it out with Sean where we could have him record, like a full Silver Mount Zion album of just the vocals, and people will get access to that if they kick in a certain amount of money to get him a helicopter.
Just an example.
Hypothetical.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's not really a whole lot more I can say about getting paid other than that would feel weird. I mean, money's weird, and I hate that we need it. But it's a reality. There's one more question.
This is why you don't troll people who have podcasts. It's because they actually hold you to it.
Yeah.
Well, so in reference to one of Bill Clinton's presidential campaigns and reaching out to the kids, because, you know, he showed what a cool guy he was, able to play the saxophone and being able to talk to the kids about stuff. You know, being asked on MTV during a so-called town hall meeting if he wore boxers or briefs. And as a way of making fun of the fact that this was going to be a more personal turn in this project.
Though we haven't gotten very personal.
No.
But we're about to.
Yeah. I will say, the question of do I wear boxers or briefs, I'm wearing multiple of both right now. Because one just sometimes isn't enough, and, you know, yeah. I also have 7 torsos, so I have needs.
True.
One for each day of the week. Do you feel like addressing the question?
I'll just say briefs. I got nothing to hide. Boxers for sleeping, briefs for jogging around.
There we are.
There we are.
It's out in the open.
Yeah. I'm closing the window now. We've talked for like an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Well, there was some stuff that in the middle that was just like, oh, I'm gonna mess with the computer, but
yeah, I think we got a good amount.
Yeah.
So is this where we, like, say goodbye to the listeners or whatever?
Oh yeah, we can say goodbye now, or we can script a goodbye later.
Yeah.
Thanks, listeners.
Thanks, listeners.
You're troopers.
You trooped.
Thanks for listening to all of that. If you liked what you heard and want to work with us, send us an email and we can start the process. Love y'all.